I'll be a friend to Jesus until my years shall end. Appreciate you helping me out with that one. If you want to, go ahead and mark the invitation song. Will be 940. 940. 940. And after you've marked that, the song before our lesson tonight will be 214. 214. Sing verses 1, 3, and 4. Have you ever stood at the ocean with the white foam at your feet? Felt the endless thundering motion? Then I say you've seen Jesus my Lord. Have you seen Jesus, my Lord? He's here in plain view. Take a look, open your eyes. He'll show it to you. Have you ever stood at the cross with a man hanging in pain? Seen the look of love in his eyes? Then I say, you've seen Jesus my Lord. Have you seen Jesus my Lord? He's here in plain view. Take a look, open your eyes. He'll show it to you. Have you ever stood in the family with the Lord there in your midst? Seen the face of Christ in your brother? Then I say, you've seen Jesus my Lord. Have you seen Jesus my Lord? He's here in plain view. Take a look, open your eyes. He'll show it to you. Go preach the word.
A day without prayer is a boast against God. We've used that expression in times past, but I can't think of a more truthful statement. A day without prayer is a boast against God, meaning that if we choose to spend a day without communicating with our Maker, in essence we're saying, we don't need you today. We're not necessarily dependent upon you today, and we can pretty much take care of our own affairs without you today. And any sort of intimate relationship with you is unnecessary today. A day without prayer is a boast against God. If you have your Bibles, turn to Psalm 5, the 5th Psalm. And it's evident that the psalmist believed that regular habitual prayer was absolutely necessary. It seems as if he believed a day without prayer was a boast against God. It's likely that the 5th Psalm was written by David. If you look at the subscript or the title, it might say something like this: to the chief musician, or some translations say to the director of music, or to the director of the choir with flutes, a Psalm of David. And so it's likely, although the title itself is not inspired, it's likely David may very well have penned this particular psalm. And as far as the Jews were concerned, traditionally they believed that he did. There may be some difficulty in ascribing this to David, because what you find in verse 7 is the psalmist says, "But as for me, I will come into your house in the multitude of your mercy." He says, "In fear of you, I will worship towards your holy temple." Well, the problem with Davidic authorship is this. When God promised David that he would build him a house and that he would have a descendant that would sit on his throne forever and ever, ultimately leading to Jesus as the fulfillment of that promise, Jesus being born of the line of David. When that promise was given, David desired to build the temple that ultimately would reside in Jerusalem. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to build God a literal house where worship could take place and transpire. But David had been a man of war, and he had spent his time in fighting his enemies. To build such an edifice really wasn't in his wheelhouse. And so the Lord told him, "You're not going to build that house," but his son Solomon would build it. And the problem with Davidic authorship, if verse 7 is talking about the temple in Jerusalem, is this: David was dead before the temple was actually finished and built. And so some people point to this and say, well, David can't be the author of this psalm because it speaks of the temple, and the temple was not a reality until after David's demise, and Solomon was the one who built it. All right. On the other hand, it's still possible, believe it or not, for David to be the author, because the word temple there can simply mean habitation or dwelling place. So if that's the case, it's not so much the temple that David or the psalmist has in mind, but the tabernacle, which of course was a reality during David's time. So I'm going to talk about this psalm as if David is the author, although I'm not certain one way or the other whether he is, but I think he certainly can be. Regarding background and backdrop, if David is our author, what was going on when he penned this psalm? Again, we don't know. This is a lament psalm. In fact, if you look at the psalm itself, it opens with, "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my meditation," or at least that's what the New King James Version says. Rather than meditation, some translations say something like this: "Give ear to the words of," or "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my sighing," or "Consider my groaning," or as the NIV says, "Consider my lament." So it's referred to as a lament psalm because the psalmist, again, we're saying this is David, there's a problem that's causing him distress. And lament psalms are interesting. Generally, they have an invocation. There's a calling upon God. And then there is a plea, an asking for God to do something. And then a complaint is given. Lord, this is what's happening in my life. And then there's confession by the psalmist. Sometimes it's confession of sin. That might be at the heart of his problems. Or it's a confession of innocence and how he's being treated unjustly. And then there's what's called imprecation, which is a big word which you'll never remember, and why I even said it I don't know. But it's the idea of calling for God to mete out vengeance against the enemies of the psalmist, which ultimately are God's enemies because the psalmist is God's man. So there's imprecation, and then there's a declaration of confidence where the psalmist believes that God will take care of his problem, and generally at the end of each lament psalm there is a blessing. It goes from, Lord, this is my problem, and then by the time you get to the end of the psalm, there's a blessing pronounced where the psalmist in great confidence believes that God's going to answer his prayer and take care of his circumstances. So the 5th psalm is a psalm of lament. It has those parts in it, has all of those components that you'll find in this kind of a psalm. This psalm also has a tie with the previous one. Psalm 5 has a tie to Psalm 4. In what sense? Psalm 4 discusses evening prayer. It's a psalm of evening prayer. Notice how Psalm 4 ends. The psalmist says, I will both lie down in peace and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. And that psalm begins with the psalmist saying, Hear me when I call, O God, my righteousness. So he prays a very similar prayer, and he says that when he lies down in sleep, he could trust in the Lord taking care of him. And then Psalm 5 opens with, Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my meditation. Give heed to the voice of my cry, my King and my God. For to you I will pray, my voice you shall hear. When? In the morning. So you find an evening prayer, Psalm 5, and you find a morning prayer, Psalm 4. And I think at some point in time, sometime back, we talked about how you can look at the contents of both Psalms and find things to pray through at night before you go to bed and things to pray about when you wake up in the morning. So there is a connection with the one that goes before it. The evening prayer, Psalm 4, and the morning prayer, Psalm 5. Having said all that, we come to the psalm itself, the psalm itself. And here's how we're going to break it down. You look at the first 3 verses of the psalm, you find the plea. The plea. Then, when you look at verses 4 to 6, you find the psalmist answering the question, what is the Lord like? Verses 1 to 3, you have the plea. Then 4 to 6, what is the Lord like? Then 7 and 8, those 2 verses, the psalmist describes what he is like, as he talks about his own attitude towards God and his own relationship with God. Then in verses 9 and 10, he answers the question, what were his enemies like? Who were these troublemakers who are causing these problems? Again, that's verses 9 and 10. And then finally, verse 11, what are the righteous like? Others like the psalmist or like David, what are they like? What did they have going for them? And then verse 12 ends with a promise, or we might say a blessing. So let's start with the plea in verses 1 to 3. The plea. And in this plea, we find 3 ideas. We find the psalmist praying with confidence. That's the first thing we're going to note. Second, he prays with regularity. That's the second thing we might want to note. And thirdly, he prays with anticipation. That's the third thing we want to note. Or we might say, again, with confidence, depending. Let's notice how the plea begins. We've already looked at it a couple of times. But he says, Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my meditation. Give heed to the voice of my cry. Notice how confidently he prays. In that, because of his relationship with the Almighty, he believes that in time of difficulty, he can bend the ear of God. He can cry out to God, believing that because he's God's man and Yahweh is his, he can ask for whatever he needs. There's a confidence in his exclamation. And you can see relationship as far as his confidence is concerned, because he says, Give heed to the voice of my cry. And then notice how he describes Yahweh, my King and my God. Throughout the Psalms, you find God referred to as King. You're my King, O God, Psalm 144 and verse 4. That's just one of the many other examples that we find in the Psalms of God being referred to in that way. And we think of the New Testament, Jesus being the God-man, the Bible describes him as King of kings and Lord of lords, 1 Timothy 6 and verse 15. But the interesting thing about what the psalmist does here is he doesn't simply refer to Yahweh as King and God, but he says, my King and my God. It's like Thomas in John 20, when he inspected the Lord's wounds, he said, my Lord and my God. We find those who are often closest to the Lord referring to him in that way, with that possessive pronoun, you are mine, my God, my Lord, my King. And if we're in Jesus, we have that same sort of a blessing. We can have that same confidence to approach God because of the relationship that we have with Him. So there's confidence involved, boldness involved, we might say, and there's regularity involved. Because he twice in this plea, in these opening verses 1 to 3, he talks about how in the morning his voice would be heard. As if to say that he's going through this difficulty, and you can imagine a tossing and turning throughout the night. And when he awakes, the first thing that he does is he prays. A day without prayer is a boast against God. David, or the psalmist in Psalm 5, he was not going to go a day without inviting God into his circumstances and communing with Him and speaking with Him. There's a regularity involved. In Psalm 55 and verse 17, David said, "Morning, noon, and evening I will pray and cry aloud, and He shall hear me." David was a man of habitual, regular prayer. He woke up in the morning, he prayed. He prayed at the appointed times, noon and evening. He prayed in the night watches. Just read Psalm 63. He would wake up and he would pray. David was a man of regular prayer. A man who would pray boldly because Yahweh was his God and his King. And a man who prayed with anticipation. Notice what the text says. He says, "In the morning I will direct it to you," that is his voice. Now, depending on your translation, there's a number of things a number of ways that statement or that phrase is translated. In fact, the most interesting one to me is the ESV, which says, "In the morning I will prepare a sacrifice for you and wait." And the reason that the ESV uses "I will prepare a sacrifice" rather than "I will direct it to you" is because within the confines of that idea of "I will direct it to you" is the same verb used in Leviticus 1 to describe the priest arranging the sacrifice on the altar. I heard one author say something like this: that may imply that when David prayed regularly, like in the morning when he awoke, his prayer was orderly and well thought out and well arranged. In other words, there are times for spontaneous prayer. Wouldn't you agree? There are times when you pray immediately based on whatever's going on in your life and whatever is on your heart. But I think it's also helpful to occasionally have those moments where you really think about what's on your heart and what's on your mind and what's going on in your life and in the lives of others in a very orderly, arranged way. You set forth the subjects that you're going to pray for and pray about, and then you pray about them line by line, item by item. That may very well be what he has in mind when he speaks of praying to God and lifting his voice, and he says, "I will direct it to you. I will prepare a sacrifice. I will arrange it." I find that quite interesting. But he prays with anticipation because he says, "I will look up," or some translations say, "I will watch." And that's an interesting word because Habakkuk uses it in Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 1 as he thinks about what's going on in the world of his people and how injustice was reigning, and he has a complaint about that. And so he gives his complaint to God, and then he says, "I will watch." In other words, he's waiting for a word for God or from God. He's waiting for God to act. And so when the psalmist or David prays here, he lifts up his voice in the morning, he arranges his prayer, and he says, "I'm going to wait. I'm going to anticipate. I'm going to watch for your move, Lord, because I believe you're going to do something. You're going to act." So that's his plea. He cries out to God. And then in verses 4 to 6, as we said a moment ago, he's going to talk about the character of the one to whom he prays. He's going to answer the question, what is the Lord like? And here's what we find. There are some ideas regarding the character of the Lord in these verses. First of all, there is the holiness of God, that He is set apart, that He is unlike any other. That not only that, He is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, and He is the one and only ruler of the universe, and He is pure in every way. So He is holy, He is pure, and He is just. All of these ideas are found in what the psalmist says. Notice, beginning in verse 4, he says, "For you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness." Again, we're going to find out he's got some enemies who are not behaving as they should, and they're causing him problems. And so he reminds God of his own character. He says, "You are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness." In other words, you're holy. You're holy. "Nor shall evil dwell with you." That idea is evil shall not be your guest. Evil will not take up residence with you. You see, God is pure. He is of pure eyes and to behold evil and cannot look upon wickedness. That's what Habakkuk said in Habakkuk 1 and verse 13. God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. 1 John 1 and verse 5. God is so holy that sin separates anyone who would commit it from God. Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2. And it's incumbent upon God, as this holy, pure God, to punish iniquity at every turn. He shall not at all clear or acquit the guilty. And so what the psalmist does is he reminds God of His holiness, of His purity, and that ultimately His character demands that He destroys the ungodly. There's a parallel. If you look at Psalm chapter 7, in verse 11, we find a similar idea regarding the justice of God, where the psalmist says, "God is a just or a righteous judge." And notice this, "and God is angry with the wicked every day." There's some strong language here as the psalmist answers the question, what is the Lord like? "You're not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, nor shall evil dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand in your sight. You hate all workers of iniquity. You shall destroy those who speak falsehood. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man." I realize for us there's a sense in which we have to grasp the concept of hate the sin and love the sinner. But there's a fine line between love and hate. Have you ever run into somebody that says, "I love her, but I can't stand her"? Well, why are you like that? Why do you feel that way? Because of the way she lives her life and what she does and how she treats people. Now, the problem with our loathing and our hatred is that it's often, if not always, impure, because we're human. But when the Bible speaks of God's hatred or loathing, He hates both the sin and the sinner. He loathes both. Now, He demands, or let me rephrase that, He desires the best for everybody. He desires all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. That's what He wants. But who ultimately will reside in perdition? What will ultimately reside in perdition? Sins or sinners? Sinners. But the point of the matter is, in this very strong language, the psalmist is reminding God of the fact that he understands His character. And he's wanting God to act out of who He is. And so he answers the question, who is like the Lord? What is He like? Well, He's holy. He's pure. He's just. He always punishes iniquity. And as the very first psalm says, the ungodly shall not stand. They eventually will fall. So he answers that question. Then he turns to himself as we look at verses 7 and 8. Now here's what we might think. He reminds God of His character and talks about how God feels about the wicked and wicked acts. But he seems to have some understanding about his own circumstance, that he could have no relationship with God. He couldn't have this intimacy of being able to confidently pray and interact with God if it were not for God's mercy, if it were not for the favor of God, which he mentions in verses 11 and 12, if it weren't for the steadfast love of God, which is what sometimes mercy is translated as in this section. Here's what I mean by that. He says, "But as for me," in other words, I've described the kind of people, Lord, that you have this holy, righteous indignation against. He says, "But as for me, I will come to your house in the multitude of your mercy, in the multitude of your steadfast love, your loyal love." What would allow David or anybody to have a relationship with God? One's own goodness and one's own righteousness? No. God's mercy. God's goodness, God's love, God's grace. The psalmist understands that he has this right to call upon God, not because of his own doing, but because of who God is. He's all the things he's mentioned, but he's also merciful. He's also graceful, full of grace, full of favor. He's loving. He says, but as for me, I will come to your house in the multitude of your mercy. In the fear of you, I will worship towards your holy temple. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before my face. What differentiates the psalmist from those who work iniquity? What will differentiate the psalmist from those that he's going to describe in verses 9 and 10? Well, first of all, he recognizes his dependence upon God's mercy. Second of all, he's devoted to the worship of God. And third of all, he desires to do the will of God. That's what differentiates us from those in the world. God's mercy is extended to all. God's grace has appeared to all men. But yet it's only those who will choose to receive that mercy and receive that grace that can have this relationship of intimacy that the psalmist has with God. And that involves, again, dependence upon Him, devotion to worship, determination to do His will. All of these things are seen. The psalmist paints a picture of who he is, and then he talks about his enemies. Now here's something that fascinates me. You say, I hope it fascinates me because nothing has yet. Here we go. He talks about what his enemies were like. And he says, for there is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is destruction. Their throat is an open tomb. They flatter with their tongue. In other words, they're liars. Now what's interesting about that is that Paul quotes that very verse in Romans 3 as he talks about the universal sinfulness of all of mankind. Why is that fascinating? Because in one sense, what Paul says about, or what the psalmist says about his enemies, there in verse 9, Paul says, it's true of every man and woman who's ever lived in one way or the other. Because that's what he quotes in Romans 3:13, after saying there is none righteous, no, not one. After saying there is none who does good, no, not one. After then, or eventually, he'll come to say, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That is the verse that he uses, or one of them, to point to all of us and say, you're in that category. That makes sense? So when David describes his enemies, Paul says, that's all of you. That's all of us. And so like the psalmist, like David, we need his mercy. We need his grace. We need his steadfast love. Or there's no hope for us. And this is interesting to me as well. This is imprecation, that big word that I mentioned earlier, where what the psalmist does, he has these enemies that are troubling him. He's God's man, and so he calls for God to punish them, to mete out justice. He says, pronounce them guilty, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions. But then notice what he says. For they have rebelled against you. There's a sense in which every sin is against God first and foremost. Are these enemies troubling David? Yes. Does he call for God to solve his problem and to punish these evildoers? Yes. But what seems to be his motivation for calling God to do it? Because their conduct was an affront to God himself. They have rebelled against you. And so we find him not seeking vengeance personally, but asking God to seek vengeance for God's sake. I don't know about you, I find that to be rather remarkable. But that's what he does. And then the last thing he deals with is the question, what are the righteous like? Others like himself who trust in the grace and the mercy of God. Well, just that. They experience the joy of trust. But let all those who rejoice who put their trust in you. They experience the joy of relationship. Let them ever shout for joy because you defend them. Let those also who love your name be joyful in you. You see, those who choose to trust in God should be the happiest people in all the world. Because the promise that we find here is that God will defend His own. If you look at the very last statement in verse 12, we find the promise that I mentioned earlier. He said, "For you, O Lord, will bless the righteous. With favor you will surround him as with a shield." And the word for shield there are at least two different words describing at least two different kinds of shields. One is very small that warriors would place on their forearm in battle. The other was a large shield that would cover practically the whole body. And that's the word that he uses here. He says, God will surround you and protect you. And you can trust that he will, and you can find great joy in knowing that as you walk with him, he's walking with you. And no matter what's going on in your life, he's there. Just briefly, here's some things that we might glean from this psalm. From verses 1 and 2, we can pray boldly. We can pray with confidence. Even more so than the psalmist, because we live on this side of the cross, and our forerunner Jesus has already gone into heaven itself, and we can follow suit, and we can come boldly before the throne of grace to obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. As God's child, God's son, God's daughter, we can enter the throne room without any fear. We can pray boldly. Here's another thing we might glean from this. We ought to pray early and often. I think it was John Bunyan who wrote, "The man who runs from God in the morning will scarcely find him throughout the day." And wasn't it Jesus that arose early in the morning, went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed, Mark 1:35. Pray early and often. Pray confidently, believing that God can and will answer in the best of ways. Ask and it shall be given to you. Seek and you shall find. Knock and it shall be opened to you. Here's an interesting point. Live to pray. You say, what do you mean by that? God doesn't hear those, refuses to hear those who are wicked, who are boastful, who are workers of iniquity, who are liars, who are impenitent. And therefore, I want to live in the opposite way. Because the promise of Scripture is the Lord will listen to and hear and act on behalf of those who strive to do his will. What was it that Peter said? For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. I need to strive to live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world for a number of reasons. It pleases God, but also I don't want my prayers to be cut off. Live to pray. What about we glean from this? Pray humbly. You see, when we humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, that allows us to cast all our cares upon him. The psalmist, there's a sense of humility in what he writes. He wants God to punish his enemies, but he recognizes he would be an enemy of God if it weren't for his mercy. He's not so concerned about himself as much as he is about God's character and God's name. There's a humility about his praying. Remember whom you are approaching when you pray. Pray as if everything is about him, because it really is. Pray humbly. And then finally, pray with joy. You see, at any time, you can pray to the God of heaven, the sovereign ruler of the universe, and he cares. We have his ear. And we can cry out in the morning. We can cry out at noon. We can cry out in the evening. We can cry out at any time. Why wouldn't we want to pray? A day without prayer is what? It's a boast against God. The psalmist reminds us of a number of important, vital elements that have to do with this wonderful exercise that draws us closer to God. I hope that what we've talked about tonight might be helpful. In order to have a relationship where you can pray to God, you first have to come to God through Jesus, which involves faith, confession, repentance, and baptism. Maybe you're standing in need of obeying the truth. We can help you tonight with that. Or maybe you just want God's people to pray for you and with you. We'd love to do that as well, believing that God will answer and do what's best. If we can help you, won't you come right now as we stand?
Hear the sweet voice of Jesus say, "Come unto me, I am the way. Hearken the loving call, obey. Come, for he loves you. the same loving Savior yet. Jesus the crucified. Open for you the pearly gate, loved ones for you. Now watch and wait. Terrible thought, to cry too late. Jesus, I come to thee. Only a step, only a step. Come, for he bled for you and died. He's the same loving Savior yet. Jesus the crucified. Amen. I appreciate, Bill, that lesson from Psalm 5. Some of the Psalms, some of them are so short, not a whole lot of verses, but man, there's a lot of depth whenever you really take some time to think about what all it says, and just the beautiful presentation of God's Word tonight. I appreciate that. Our closing song tonight is going to be 202. If you were not able to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, there will be someone at the back who will help you administer that to you. Other than that, hope that you'll come back for a midweek Bible study, 7 o'clock on Wednesday. Anything else that we need to announce? Nope. All right, 202. We'll sing verses 1 and 4. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, Lord of love. Hearts unfold like flowers before thee, opening to the sun above. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness, drive the dark of doubt away. Giver of immortal gladness, fill us with the light of day. Mortals join the mighty chorus which the morning stars began. Father, love is reigning o'er us. Brother, love binds man to man. Ever singing march we onward, victors in the